We have been fed a bunch of lies and half-truths about inflation, employment, and interest rates. They form a Gordian Knot designed to destroy your ability to reason about the economy, which is exactly what you would expect from a Marxist organization like the Federal Reserve. Milei slices through all this crap, not only the theory, but the reality. Before we get to how Milei cut through all this crap, let's look at some clips that explain some of these economic half-truths and lies. One of the economic lies that we've all been indoctrinated in is called the Phillips curve, which purports that there's a trade between employment and inflation. Here's a clip that explains it.
So what is the Phillips curve? Well, in simple terms, it's a relationship between unemployment and inflation. And if you want a really simple explanation, it's this. When inflation is high, unemployment is low. And when inflation is low, unemployment is high. And that's really all it's about. This relationship can be represented on a graph, and it's this which is known as the Phillips curve.
What's amazing about the Phillips curve is that it was developed as a statistical model from the data in England. There's all sorts of data, for instance, from pre-Federal Reserve data in the US, that shows that the Phillips curve makes no sense at all. Another half-truth that we've all been indoctrinated in is that by raising interest rates, we lower inflation. And if we lower interest rates, we stimulate the economy, as explained in this next clip.
Inverse relationship between inflation and interest rates. Inflation seems to be a hot topic, with many nations seeing greater inflation than usual. Why? Well, the main reason is of course due to the global pandemic over the last 2 years and the subsequent supply chain problems that have arisen, causing a spike in demand and price increases everywhere. To fight rapid inflation, certain governments around the world have increased interest rates. For instance, the Bank of England in the UK increased interest rates only recently from 0.1% to 0.25%.
According to this clip, inflation was caused by a spike in demand and a global disruption of the supply chain. Luckily, the white knights at the Federal Reserve and other central banks were there to save us by raising interest rates. So what are we left with? We're left with, we can either have high unemployment and low inflation, or low unemployment and high inflation. Clearly, the economy is unstable like a ball on the top of a hill, constantly ready to fall off the edge. Only by micromanaging interest rates can the Federal Reserve save us from this terrible fate. So how did Milei cut through this Gordian knot?
We are convinced about the monetary nature of inflation. That is, inflation for us is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, generated by an excess of money supply, either because the supply goes up or because the demand falls, or because both things happen at the same time, and that generates a loss of the purchasing power of money. That is, and all the prices expressed in monetary units go up. That is our diagnosis. Now, given this background, as we are proposing this, there are other professionals who consider that inflation is multifaceted and all that kind of thing. The truth is that they are hypotheses to which I did not adhere. But that is part of another discussion. I come to tell you how we see it, what we are doing, and then those who really understand, who end up writing the story as it unfolds. The question is, where does this hypothesis come from? I mean, how do we look at this problem? From my point of view, the first thing we have to do is to not define inflation as the increase in prices, but the loss of purchasing power of money. Because if the problem is the increase in prices, the usual pitfalls appear, which have been failing for more than 4,000 years, trying to control prices.
Milei states that inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon. Here Milei is parroting the words of Milton Friedman. who, when he investigated the Fed and pointed out that inflation was always a monetary phenomenon, came a little too close to pointing out the fraud that the Federal Reserve was committing. So the Fed had to create another half-truth. There are 4 types of money, M0 through M4. And commercial banks, which are fractional reserve banks, create money whenever they give out a loan. Thus, the Federal Reserve argues that if they raise interest rates, they reduce the number of loans outstanding, and thus they reduce the money supply, which reduces inflation. The only problem with this argument is we had fractional reserve banks before the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, and there was no net inflation before the Federal Reserve was created, as this chart shows. Commercial banks do not create money out of thin air. What commercial banks do is securitize assets other than gold. For instance, real estate, businesses, and capital goods. So how does the Federal Reserve create inflation? By increasing the monetary base. The Federal Reserve increases the money supply whenever it increases its balance sheet. It usually does this by buying government bonds, although it can do it in other ways. Throughout history, the motivation for creating inflation, from the ancient Romans to today, is always because of government deficit spending. It's a way for the government to raise taxes without looking like it's doing so. It's deceitful and allows politicians to blame businesses or labor unions or others for the inflation that is their fault. So if raising interest rates does not reduce inflation, what does it do? What it does do is it reduces the demand. And if you reduce the demand, you also reduce the prices. Thus, I would somewhat disagree with Milei's definition of inflation. Inflation is not a loss of purchasing power. Inflation is an increase in the monetary supply. The result is a loss of purchasing power. This can also happen because of supply shocks. The prices of things can go up because there's a war or because there's a famine. This definition also makes it clear that technology does not cause deflation. What technology does is increase the supply, causing prices to drop. By defining inflation as an increase in the money supply, we can differentiate between supply shocks and increases in the money supply as the cause of the change in prices. In this clip, Milei points out that conventional economists said that they needed to raise interest rates to reduce inflation.
Because what a large part of the economics profession suggested to us was that we raise the interest rates, that we take it to a positive level. The real interest rate. And the reality is that if we had done that, today we would be arguing about a passive monetary relationship against the base of more than 10 times, and we would be arguing about the carry trade. We would be arguing about when we would be able to fly through the air, and we would be arguing that the inflation doesn't go down because of the expectation of emissions, since those remunerated passives are future emissions, consequently never went down, which would have been a huge mistake. There's obviously a whole discussion about whether to use the interest rate or not. I mentioned that at the last meeting of the central bank.
If Milei had taken the advice of conventional economists, he would have had to raise the interest rate to over 3,000%, which definitely would have killed off the economy, and unemployment would have spiked. So how did Milei cut the Gordian Knot? Well, he immediately cut spending about 30%, which reduced the deficit to zero on a monthly basis. And this meant there was no justification for monetary emissions. He also got rid of legal tender laws, allowing people to use whatever currency they chose so they could escape the ravages of inflation. The result was in 1 year, the inflation fell from about 3,600% down to 9%. And unemployment basically remained steady throughout the year at about 6.9%. Milei has absolutely proven that there's no connection between unemployment and inflation rates. The Phillips curve is dead. He's also shown that you do not have to raise interest rates in order to kill off inflation. Trump should take a page from Milei. He should cut the federal budget by $2 trillion, which would basically balance the budget, and he should audit the Fed and end this Marxist organization once and for all.